Hey, this is Donnie, and thank you for stopping by Collision Blast's YouTube channel. We have a lot of training available for you here, but we have a lot more training for you at collisionblast.com. We have a lot of videos, hours of free access to training videos, and we have ebooks that are ready for you, and they're free. All you have to do is go to collisionblast.com and subscribe, and we'll send you all that information absolutely free. So enjoy this video and go to collisionblast.com and subscribe to us. This video tutorial is going to provide some tips for prepping a car for paint. These are tips that will help you eliminate many of the mistakes made when spraying a car or prepping a car, getting it ready to spray. And if you'll follow these steps, you will eliminate many of those mistakes that are often overlooked or skipped. So let's go ahead and get started. The professional paint job is not about a fancy paint gun. And I know you may think that the most important thing is your spraying techniques, getting all that mastered, your overlap, and getting everything just right in the paint booth. However, most of the high quality paint job starts before you ever get the car in the paint booth, and that's in your prep stages. Prep stages is perhaps the most important step that you can follow to produce that high quality paint job. And one of the first things that you want to do is wash your car. Washing is very important, but often skipped or overlooked. I mean, you get the car in, you just want to start, working on it. You want to start sanding it, if you're just going to paint or if you're doing body work. However, when you're sanding all that, you're just sanding and smearing that silicone and wax and greases into the paint surface. And then whenever you go to wash it before you paint it, some of that doesn't come off too good. So it's always a good idea to wash the car before you do any work to it. You want to get silicones. Silicones come from wax. Anytime if you wax your car, you're going to have silicone on there. Just from the environment, driving behind a diesel or just, it's all over. Using Armor All on your tires or your interior, the silicones become airborne and they stick to your paint. And it's necessary to get that off. And if you don't, you're going to have problems like fish eyes. When you go to painting, you're may have paint failures. Just a lot of problems that's not necessary. These can be eliminated. And you want to wash it. Wash anything that's going to be painted. Really, really good before you start. Now, some people may not like to use dish soap. I've used dish soap for a long time. It works well, but there is something you need to look for. There are some dish soaps that have hand ingredients in it to help keep your hands soft or moist or whatever that is. If it has any of that in it, you're going to be contaminating the paint with those products. So you want to make sure it's just a dish soap that doesn't have any of that in there. Now you can use a car soap as well, but there are a lot of car soaps that have silicone and waxes in it to help prevent from stripping your waxes off. Now you don't want that. You want to strip the wax off the car. So make sure the car soap does not have anything, have any silicones in it or anything that tries to protect your wax. And your instructor or your supervisor, where you work or go to school at, I'm sure they already have a method that they use or the type of soap. But if you're DIY, be sure and keep those things in mind. You want to use a dish soap that has no ingredients to keep your hands soft, or a car soap that has no silicones to protect your wax. So you're going to wash your car really good, and then you want to do another step and to assure all wax and grease contaminants are off, and that's to wipe the area that you're going to be painting with wax and grease remover. And you put the wax and grease remover on there and wipe it off, and this just assures that all traces of contaminants are removed from the paint surface. So once all that is done, now you can continue your prepping steps, but make sure that you do this first. Now this may have been done before you even started the body work, and that's fine. Just make sure that you do start, you do follow those steps before you start sanding and everything. Give you a little example, put this in perspective a little bit. Let's say that you are going to prep a car, and you're going to prep it for an excellent painter. Let's just say Chip Foose, from Overhauling. He's well known for his spraying abilities, his artistic abilities, his airbrush. I mean, just really very talented person. Well, he's going to spray the car for you, but that's all he's going to do is walk in the booth and spray it. And your job is to prep it and get it ready for him. And you don't wash the car before you start on it. You don't sand it really good. When you come to masking time, you just kind of throw some masking paper on there and tape it up a little bit. Then he comes in there with all of his ability and gives his everything he has to producing a top-notch, high-quality paint job. Well, what do you think the car's going to look like? Car pickup or whatever you're painting. It's going to look horrible. I mean, there's going to be dirt in it where you didn't wash good. There's going to be fish eyes where all the silicones wasn't removed. Areas where it wasn't sanded good may have a paint adhesion failure where it starts peeling. Where you didn't mask good, you're going to see overspray. I mean, it's just going to look horrible. It would look like an amateur sprayed that car, even though it's someone with that much talent. So with that said, that kind of puts it in a different perspective to where the prepping has to be done right in order for the spraying to be right. Now, if you prep that car and you did a really good job, and then someone real talented sprayed it, it's going to be a different story. It's going to look awesome. So anyway, I just want to stress that a little bit. Cleaning is so important. You're going to clean it, before you start working and sanding. You're going to wash it before you paint it, after all the sanding has been done. So, prepping is a lot of washing. So just wanted to stress that out a little bit and make sure that, I pointed that out because this is often overlooked. You do not want to skip that step. Once it's all washed and contaminants are off, then we can continue our repair process. Now, in another video, we talked about, dent repair. We repaired a dent, and then we put body filler on, and then we finish it out with 150. Now, it doesn't have to be 150. There's a range of grits of sandpaper that you can use, anywhere between 150 and 180 or even 220. And that range is used to finish out the body filler before applying primer surfacer. So for this example, this video, we're just going to say it's sanded with 150 and it's ready for primer. However, where you grinded the paint to put the body filler, that edge, you have a really hard edge there. We need to smooth that out somehow. And also, when you was blocking, you may have blocked past your body filler area and scratched your paint surface with whatever you're sanding with. It could be 36, 80, 150, and you're going to have scratches in the paint that will need to be smoothed out as well. So what these areas are going to have to be sanded out. And the way we do this, or what we call this, is feather edging. That's where you take that edge, where your grinder was, your paint edge, and you basically make a hard edge and you turn it into a smooth edge. And you're basically layering each layer of paint. So when you do this, you want to see each layer of paint. For example, on a car, you're going to have your undercoatings, a primer. You're going to have your color and clear coat. All those are different layers of paint. And you want to try to layer each one at least 1/4 of an inch. It can be more, but you want to be able to see each layer of paint at least 1/4 of an inch. That way it's going to be a smooth transition from your bare metal to the top of your clear coat. If you don't do that, if you don't get that smooth and feather edge that out, you're probably going to be able to see that after it's painted. You're going to look at it at an angle and see a little wave there, or a ring. That's due to not proper feather edging. Or if there was some scratches that you didn't sand out and you prime and block it, it may look good at that point. But if that primer shrinks a little bit, it's going to shrink inside of those scratches, and then you're going to be able to see sand scratches there. So we're going to feather edge around there to get that good and smooth, a real smooth transition. You can think of it like layering the paint, feathering the paint, however you want to think about that. But that's the process that we're doing. And to do that, we are going to use a DA sander, a dual action sander, and 220 grit sandpaper. And in this photo here, if you look, there's a DA, there's some sandpaper. That's 500 grit sandpaper. That's for final sanding. We want to use 220 grit. And there's an interface pad. Now, we don't want to use the interface pad for feather edging, because feather edging is basically the process of leveling out the paint surfaces. Anytime you're leveling, a harder surface is going to work better. Now this interface pad is real soft, so that's not going to work well for that. Now that will work well when we do our final sanding, and we don't want to get marks from the DA, from the edge of it digging into the paint and causing little swirl marks or anything like that. That interface pad works excellent for that. But for feather edging, just use the DA and sandpaper, and that will level out those the feather edge better than using the pad. So anyway, then we're going to got that all, each layer out 1/4 of an inch. Now we want to talk about, why do we sand? We talk about sanding a lot, of course, and we've been talking about, leveling and but let's say that's a area that doesn't have any body work. Why do we sand that? We don't need to shape that or level it or anything like that. And I wanted to mention that because there is a confusion about that, because I hear a lot, or I've heard, that, well, you got to sand it to smooth it up, and that's actually the opposite of that. You're sanding it to rough it up, because you're providing sandpaper has a grit in it, and you're actually putting small little scratches. It's fine scratches for final sanding, but you're putting fine little scratches so when that paint will fall in those scratches and give it something to bite to hold on to. That way it doesn't peel. You have good adhesion. So we're actually sanding to rough the surface up. Just kind of wanted to mention that, so there's no confusion there. When you're sanding, you basically, when you're selecting a grit, you want to select one that does the fastest job with the least amount of effort. Now, depending on what you're spraying, it's going to determine the grit also. So for primer, like I mentioned, anywhere from 150 to 220, that primer is going to fill those with no problem and block out, primer surfacer. Paint, you would see the scratches if you sprayed paint. If you sprayed paint over 150 grit, you're going to see those scratches. So we've got to go with something finer. And for spraying paint, manufacturers may vary a little bit, and this is in reference to solvent paint, in this video, but a range of from anywhere to 400 grit to 600 grit. So your base coat is going to fill those scratches. So 600 will work. It's going to take a little more effort. 400 will work as well. Takes less effort. So, and then if you're clear coating, if you're not putting any paint on and you're just clear coating, if you use 400 grit scratches, you're going to see through that and you're going to see the scratches. So you got to go with something finer. So anywhere from 8 to 1200, if you sand it with that, you're not going to see the scratches through the clear coat. Now you're going to have to work a little bit harder because it's a finer grit, but it'll all achieve the same thing. So just wanted to touch on that a little bit. Mechanical adhesion. This just kind of expands on sanding a car to provide that tooth for it. It's a mechanical adhesion. If the paint was not sanded and it's just that real glossy, smooth finish, it'd peel off because there's no mechanical adhesion. If you can imagine painting a piece of glass, it's so smooth it wouldn't stick. It'd just peel off. And that's same way with the car. If we didn't sand it, the coatings that we put on top are just going to peel off. So when we sand it, we put those little scratches in it. We provide a mechanical adhesion, and then we have good adhesion. It won't peel on us. Okay, in this we're going to talk about painting the entire panel, and there's different ways of doing this. This is, for example, if you got let's say you have a brand new panel and it had a ding in it when it came in, but you're going to be painting the entire panel. This is the process that you would use. In a minute we're going to talk about blending within a panel where you may not be painting the whole panel. You're going to clear coat the whole panel but not paint, and that's a different process that we'll talk about. But let's take this fender that we had a dent in it. We finished the body work with 150 grit, and that's the first little circle. Now you may have to use your imagination here with my graphics here, but the first little circle is 150 grit. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to feather edge each layer of paint out at least 1/4 of an inch, where you can see those layers 1/4 of an inch, and that's the next few rings in there, where it's layered out. And then we're going to do that with 220 grit. And then the area that we're going to paint, anywhere we're going to paint, we're going to use, like I said, anywhere from 400 to 600. We may sand past our 220 grit area, a little bigger area with 320, where the primer is going to go. And the method I'm telling you, this is not the only method. Your instructor or supervisor may have a little different method that they use, but I generally like to go ahead and prep the whole panel and sand the whole panel, before I do any priming. And the reason I think that's a good idea is if any overspray gets on the unsanded, it lands pat. Sometimes when you're priming, it just gets a little bigger than you intended. And if it's not sanded underneath the primer, that primer is going to peel. So even though you sanded the primer and it's smoothed up and looks good and feathered in, if it's not stuck to the paint good, it's going to peel later. So this way, if you have it all sanded, if your primer spot does get a little bigger than you intended, it's still going to be on a sanded surface that has mechanical adhesion. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and sand that, and then out past where I feather edged, I'm going to hit it with a little bit of 320, and that's where the primer's going to be at. And then the rest of the panel, we're going to paint that entire panel, so we can just paint it, sand it with 400 to 600. If you're wet sanding, you can use 400 grit because it takes less effort. And again, you may check with your paint manufacturer to see what they recommend, but for the paints I use, 400 grit works real well. And the base coat covers that. You don't see any scratches through it. You can use up to 600, and 600 will achieve the same result, but it's just going to take a little bit more effort to get it there. You can also use a DA sander, a dual action sander, to do your final sanding. 500 works real well for that. It is a finer grit, but it works so much faster. It's going to take a lot less effort than the wet sanding by hand. So we're going to go ahead and sand that entire fender. Then we can do our priming, our blocking, and then it'll be ready for paint. Okay, now we're going to talk about blending within a panel. And the same steps are going to be followed for the priming and blocking. We got our 150 grit, and then we've got our where we DA, feather edge, and where we prime, we're going to hit some 320, and then go out with 500. The area is going to be painted. Now the outside circle there is the area that we're going to spray paint, and that's what's going to be sanded with the 500, or 400 to 600, depending on your preference. Now we're going to go ahead and clear coat that whole panel though. But we don't want to sand that with the 400 to 600, or you will be able to see through the clear coat and see the scratches. Now there are some painters that I've talked to that have said they put the clear coat over 600 grit scratches and don't have any problems. I don't recommend that. I've never done that, but I'd prefer doing it anywhere between 8 and 1200 grit. I usually use 800 grit. The clears I use cover those scratches fine, and you never see those scratches. So the entire panel I'm going to final sand with 800 grit sandpaper. You can do that wet or dry. You can use a DA, but there are a few things you got to be very careful about whenever sanding a panel just for clear coat. You do want to get your edges really good, because remember, if the paint's going to peel, it's going to start from the edges. So make sure all the edges are good, but you got to be very careful not to sand through. You don't want to sand through your clear coat or your paint, because if you just clear coat over that, there's no paint, there's nothing going to cover that. If you sanded through, you're going to see that through your clear coat. So you got to be very careful not to sand through, and that's another reason I'd be very careful. If I was trying 600 grit, be very careful not to sand through any edges. If you're afraid you may sand through some edges, you may use 1000 grit. That'll provide a little extra work there before you would sand through. When painting, a red scuff pad works. You can use a red scuff pad to get the hard to get areas, your edges, and things like that, but that is a little too coarse. You'll see those scratches just through where you're clear coating. So where just clear coat's going to be applied, You can use a gray scuff pad, a gray Scotch Brite to get your edges in hard to get areas, where clear coat's going to be applied. So if you'll follow these sanding techniques and assure all the edges are sanded good, you'll eliminate pilling, the pilling problems. And that's, you see a lot of improper sanding is not the only reason for pilling. There's some other pilling reasons paint will peel, which we're probably not going to get into in the prepping video. But one of the most common problems or issues for paint peeling is, because it wasn't sanded good in that area. So, I see a lot of times, the main areas, the centers of areas get sanded extremely good, and the edges, the hard to get places don't get sanded hardly at all. And it should be not necessarily the opposite, because you do want the bigger areas to be sanded good, but you want those edges sanded good as well. So if you want to eliminate pilling, make sure that you sand really good. And an easy way to tell if an area is sanded well is if it looks dull, because when you sand something, it gives it a dull appearance. If you clean your car off and you see a real glossy spot or a glossy edge, you need to go back and hit that area either with the 400 to 600 grit sandpaper or with a scuff pad. Or if you're clear coating, you'd want to use a finer grit, just depending on what you're doing to that area. But want to try to make sure there's no glossy areas left, and that will assure that you're going to get proper adhesion. Now we're going to talk about masking, and in this photo you see where it's masked off square like that. That's something that you don't want to do, is make a really hard edge around your repair area. And the reason this is done is to keep your primer area small. Now another method for doing that is just to mask off adjacent panels and moldings. But like for that area, just turn your pressure down, make a smaller pattern, and don't mask anything. If it's not necessary to mask it, I kind of leave it open, and that way your primer will kind of feather itself out. Now if you did mask a square edge like this, you would not want to prime all the way to that tape edge, because that would leave a hard edge, and those hard edges are hard to sand off. It takes a lot of extra time, a lot of extra effort, and I've even seen where you sand those edges off, and after it's painted you still see that edge a little bit. So one method that I've seen used is back masking, and that's where you flip the paper around where the back edge of the tape kind of makes a softer edge. But still, if you're spraying all the way to that edge, it's going to make an edge that's going to be hard to sand off. So I kind of like the primer just to kind of feather out onto the paint, rather than have these squares around it. So I've seen this a lot. I'm sure you've seen cars riding around that have these little squares, that masked or primer spots on them. But that's going to cause a lot of problems when they go to sanding, and possibly might even see it through the paint. Again, has this car been painted? And we're talking about masking. One of the easiest indications to determine if a car's been painted is by the way it was masked. And the thing about it is you don't have to be a trained professional to see this. If you see a jam that has a real hard edge on it, or around some of your moldings have overspray or primer or paint on them, I mean, anybody can see that. So it's a very easy way to determine if a car's been painted. So I know a lot of, you may think that, masking's not that important when in the overall picture, and, rush through those steps, but actually this is something that you want to do, really good. Take your time doing it, so that after the car's painted, even though the car looks good, you can't tell that it's been painted, because the objective of making a repair is to make an invisible repair, and that's where you cannot tell that the car's been painted. And so take your time when masking, and do a really good job with that. Now we're going to start talking about primers, and there's different primers for different things that you're going to be doing. For example, for corrosion protection, for bare metal, you want a certain primer. Whenever you're filling scratches or body work, you want a certain primer. And then for color hiding, for covering what's underneath. You want a primer sealer. So I've got a little chart. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Now in this first column, you're going to see corrosion protection. Anytime you have bare metal, you can't just put regular primer surfacer on top of that. There's one of these three primers can be used. You can use a self-etch primer, and that's a one-part primer that has acid in it, and the acid bites to the metal, and it does provide corrosion protection. This is it's fast to use this method. It's real quick. A lot of your production shops that do a lot of work use this because it is a lot faster than the next one, the epoxy. Now, epoxy works really good. It's probably the superior, for corrosion protection, but the disadvantage of epoxy is a little bit slower. I mean, it's a two-part primer that you have to mix. It's a little bit slower drying. I mean, it takes a little bit longer to use the epoxy than the self-etch. So production shops may prefer the self-etch primer. Restoration or DIY, it's probably going to lean towards the epoxy. And then there's a third method, and that's direct to metal. And what this is it's a primer that has the corrosion protection in it. It has acid that bites into the metal a little bit, but then it's also a primer surfacer. So any primer surfacer has to be sanded. So this has to be sanded if you use this. But if you have body work and some metal, you can put this over it, let it dry, and sand it out. So that's another method that you can use. So 3 different methods. And also I'd like to mention, if you look at the very bottom of this, you'll see an arrow going from bare metal to sealer. If you don't have any scratches or body work that you're trying to fill the scratches in, you don't need to use primer surfacer. That is just to fill scratches. So if you had you stripped a fender down to metal and put some epoxy on it, or self-etch primer, whatever method you use, you could go straight to the last step, and you could either use a primer sealer, or you could top coat it, depending on your paint system, what your paint manufacturer recommends. A lot of times the epoxy is used as a sealer. So if you epoxy it, you've already sealed it also, so you don't have to, you just basically skip that center section. Okay, the center is for filling imperfection. This is for minor imperfections, scratches, from the 220 and 150 grit, all that. You got to get all that out there and get it smooth, and that's what this is for. Anytime you do body work, you need to use primer surfacer, and there's basically these 3 that you can use. You can use a 2K primer surfacer. That's a primer that mixes with the catalyst, and that's probably the what you use the most. It works real well. But there's also a 1K primer surfacer, and this is still used some, but it was like lacquer. Is what this makes me think of, because for a long time that's all we had was lacquer primer. Everybody used it, and it was a 1K. It works. It shrinks more. If you have scratches, it might shrink up in the scratches. It's not near as good as the 2K, but it is something that worked for many years. And then we have the direct metal. So if you already applied to the direct metal in step 1, you don't need to apply more for step 2. You just sand it. And then we have primer sealer, and there's different primer sealers that paint manufacturers make, and also epoxies a lot of time is used as sealer, primer sealer. So, and what a sealer is for is to hide imperfections. So for example, if we are spraying a dark red metallic that has a lot of metallics, something that has a lot of metallic doesn't have a lot of pigment, and pigment is the color, so it doesn't hide real good. So if we've got a gray spot from the primer and we put some paint over that gray spot, it's not going to cover it too good. It's going to take a lot of coats to finally get that to completely hide that gray spot. Well, if we use sealer, we use a sealer that's about the same shade, that's darker, it'll help hide that. So you put that sealer on that gray spot, and now we only have to use a couple of coats of paint. So that's what primer sealer is for. It's for hiding what's underneath. So, there's There are a few other combinations out there. I don't want to get too confusing. It's just kind of keeping it basic, but there are some primer surfacers that are tintable. And if you're painting a dark color, you would tint it. It would be a dark primer. So after it's sanded, you already got the darker spot. So you don't have to use the primer sealer. Most paint manufacturers do, recommend primer sealer, but I just recommend that you look for the P pages or technical data sheet for the specific paint line that you're using, and see what they recommend. And another thing I want to mention is like using the epoxy or self-etch, the first column for corrosion protection. That does not need to be sanded. You allow it to flash, and then you put your primer surfacer. And then you let it dry, and it has to be sanded. Then you apply your primer sealer, and you allow it to flash, and then you paint. So you don't sand your primer sealer, and you don't sand your self-etch or epoxy primer. You can spray straight over those. So anyway, I hope this kind of helps you understand what the different primers are used for. Now we got it ready. You got it all ready to spray. Got it all feather edged and final sanded. And now we're going to start spraying primer. Wipe the area with wax and grease remover to make sure the area that you're going to be priming is clean of all contaminants. You're going to want to mask the area off so you don't get overspray on adjacent panels. A lot of times it's a good idea to go ahead and drop a sheet of plastic over the entire car, if you're priming a bigger area. You want to prevent overspray from getting on areas that should be. Like I mentioned, I don't like putting the little squares around the repair areas. If that is a method that you use, be sure and do the back masking and try not to prime all the way to the edge. And then whenever you start applying the primers, self-etch, that's generally used real light coats. You don't want to put that on too heavy because it has that acid in it. That could bite into your paint and cause lifting problems or something like that. So be sure and put that on 1 to 2 light coats. Epoxy, that goes over most coatings without any problems. Usually 1 to 2 coats. Look at your P pages to determine what the specific product that you're using, but usually 1 to 2 coats is sufficient. And then allow that to flash. Then you're going to spray your primer surfacer on any areas you did body work or where there's scratches. And usually 2 to 3 coats is recommended. Again, look at your P pages. So you're going to put your epoxy, allow that to flash for 30 minutes. Put your 2 coats of primer surfacer, allowing 5 to 10 minutes depending on what your P pages say between coats. Now it's important to wait between that flash time. So you put 2 coats on, and then you got to stop, let the primer surfacer, and then allow it to dry. Then block sand it. So I keep mentioning flash times. I want to expand on that just a little bit to help clear that up. When you spray something on there, it has solvents in it, and that solvent has to evaporate. It has to evaporate out of the surface. If you just put one coat on top of another, you're going to trap those solvents in there, and they're going to come out eventually. But when they do, it may cause different types of problems. It may cause adhesion problems, solvent popping, a lot of different things. So be sure to look at your P pages or technical data sheet for the product you're using, and allow the proper time for flash. If it says 5 minutes, allow it to flash for 5 minutes. And another thing to consider, if it says allow to flash for 5 minutes, whenever they did that study, most of them use around 70-degree weather. Well, if you're in a shop that's 60 degrees, you may allow it to dry a little bit longer. If it's 100 degrees, it may not take quite as long. So something to think about, and be sure and look at your P pages to determine what that time is, the flash time. So we've got flash time and we've got a window time. Now these are different. So let's talk about the epoxy, because it has a real long window. And what that is how long you have to recoat it without sanding. So with epoxy, the one I use, You have to wait 30 minutes, allow that to flash, allow the solvents to escape for 30 minutes, and then you can put your primer surfacer. But let's say that you get it epoxied and it's closing time, you go home. Can you come back the next morning and spray primer surfacer? Well, with this you can, because you have 72 hours. If you spray on top of that within 72 hours, you do not have to sand it, because you've got that chemical adhesion period. If you wait longer than 72 hours, you're going to have to provide that mechanical adhesion, so you're going to have to come back and sand it. So flash time is how long you have to wait. Window is how long you have before having to sand before recoating. So epoxies generally have a long window like that. Some base coats, are 24 hours, but again, this is going to be different on all products. So let's check the P pages on that. Mechanical versus chemical adhesion. Well, we've talked a lot about mechanical adhesion. That provides that tooth, that roughs up the paint so that the paint has something to stick to, And the chemical adhesion is done chemically. That's where two chemicals still bond together without the scratches, without that tooth to bite to. And chemical adhesion is only going to last so long, and that's the window time. Once that's gone, your chemical adhesion, you don't have it anymore. You're going to have to provide mechanical. That's why we have to resand. So mechanical is produced by sanding. Chemical is a period of time you have where the chemicals will bond together. Okay, let's get back on we got the primer surfacer sprayed. Now we need to block sand it. And I generally use 320 grit, block it out. And you want to use a block because we're trying to level the surface, make sure that all imperfections are smoothed up and all scratches are removed. Now the best way to do this is to use what you call a guide coat. And this is comes in dry form, that like a powder you put on there on the primer area, or they also have spray that you spray on there. And you want it to be a contrasting color. For example, if it's a gray primer, you can use a black guide coat. And what that does is just helps you identify any highs or lows. If there's a scratch, and you're using a block, it's going to stay in that scratch, and you can see, well, I haven't sanded all the guide coat off. So I need to either continue sanding. Sometimes you may have to reprime. What you don't want to do is think the main objective is to sand all of the guide coat off, because I've seen many times where there might be some guide coat a little low or scratch or something, and start tilting the block over trying to sand it out. Well, that's defeating the whole purpose of guide coat. If you're going to tilt the block to sand it out, you're basically sanding that low area or scratch. It's going to be low where you sanded it. So if the guide coat stays there, that's good. It's doing its job. And sometimes you can sand till it sands out, but if you start sanding through the primer, you need to stop. It's going to have to be primed again to fill that area. So, and another tip when block sanding is to use longer sanding strokes. Don't do real choppy short strokes, because after it's painted, it may give it kind of a choppy appearance. So use longer sanding strokes, and continue to use the cross sanding method. That helps level, to assure everything's good and level, and there won't be any wavy areas that are not noticeable after the car has been painted. Then once you've blocked, you're going to start final sanding. And again, final sanding, depending if the entire area is going to be painted or just clear coated, it's going to determine the grit. But final sanding is the last step you do as far as sanding. And again, if you're going to be painting, like if you're painting an entire car, you're going to sand the entire car with 400 to 600. And make sure to get the edges good. Hard to get areas, use a red scuff pad. If you're just doing a spot and you're just going to clear coat the rest of the panel, let's say you're doing a blend job, or you're going to clear coat a couple of panels, prep that spot out, with 500 where paint's going to be applied, and the rest of it, use 8 to 1200 grit to where only clear coat is going to be applied. And again, make sure all your edges are sanded good. Be careful not to sand through any of the edges, because that'll show through the clear. And don't use a red scuff pad where only clear coat is going to be applied. For your hard to get areas and edges, you can use a gray scuff pad. Masking for paint. Again, we talked about the importance of this and how if it's not masked properly, it's a good identifier that the car's been painted. So we need to properly mask a car to make that invisible repair that we've talked about. You want to start masking your jambs first. You want to start inside out, because if you start outside in, you may trap yourself to where the whole side of the car glass is masked off. You have to cut it open to get the door open. So it's always a good idea to mask the jambs first. Now, before you start masking the jambs, make sure that you wipe all the jambs really good with wax and grease remover, or the tape's not going to stick well. So clean the jambs really good, and then one method is just like you see in this picture where we're using 1.5-inch tape. We're putting it over there and then we're folding it backwards where it makes a smoother edge. There's not a straight tape line edge there. This is called back masking. That way, whenever the paint folds around the corner, and you do want it to come around the corner just a little bit, the edge, or else you're going to see that line. So as the paint sprays around that corner about 1/4 inch, then it's going to hit that tape edge, and it's going to make a smoother edge, a less noticeable edge. That's one method. They also have aperture tape. This is a foam tape, and it works well for doing your jambs. You basically put, you clean your jamb, and then you put this foam tape along the edge. Then when you shut your door or hood or trunk or whatever, it makes a seal that seals off the interior. And this works really well for masking off jambs. This is probably the most common used method for masking jambs. Then they also make a special tape for this. This just a thin piece of plastic tape, and in the center it has adhesive. And then on each side of that adhesive, is just a piece of plastic which provides a real smooth line, where the paint doesn't make a real hard edge. And you can use a couple of layers of this along the jambs. You can put a coat on, peel the first layer off, put the second coat on, or second coat of coating on, and then you can kind of layer it that way to where you can almost make an invisible line with this. I mean, it works real well. I've even seen guys use this on body lines, like if they're going to be painting a partial panel, that's usually not recommended, but it does, it almost makes an invisible line where you can do that. This works really good. It's probably a little more expensive than the other methods, but this is a method that can be used. And I just want to mention several different methods. Your school or your where you're working at, they may use one of these different methods, and I just want you to be a little bit familiar with them. Anyway, that wraps up this video. I want to thank you for watching this, and again, I want to mention that there's a lot of ways to do this. I've just mentioned some of the ways. I want you to discuss this with your supervisor or instructor to see if these are the steps. If anything varies, be sure to write it down and put it in a notebook so you'll have a reference to follow, and kind of have the procedures that your school or your place of work uses, and that way you'll have something to look at. If you ever get a little bit confused or you're not for sure, you'll have it. You'll have it right there with you. And if you're DIY, this is some steps here. I have a more detailed Kindle book. It's available on Amazon, and if you just go to Amazon, type in Donnie Smith and look for one for paint prep, that's it. And it goes into a lot more detail. This video is just a quick overview, and that book gives more step-by-step and has a lot of resources and additional videos that you can to help further understand prepping. But for whatever reason you're watching this video, whether you're new at this, if you're a beginner, just got out of school working at a shop, or you're in school, you're a student, or you're DIY, I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. And if you have any questions, be sure and leave a comment below, and we'll try to get it answered for you. Thanks for watching and have a good day.